So we're moving, right across the globe, from starting with Czechoslovakia. So Johana, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Johana Kłusek, is that correct?
Hey,
Johana?
hello everyone. It's Johana. Yeah, it's Johana.
Great to have you on board. So you're a PhD candidate in Prague at Charles University. And I think it's really interesting what you're going to talk about, because we're so used to news, if it leads, it bleeds, that is very anxiety inducing. So you're going to talk about a particular period in Czechoslovakian history where they were trying to reduce or minimize the level of news that was being portrayed. And your particular year is, it's 19, what year is it? It's 1938, yes, that should be really interesting. So
do we want to give people another 2 more minutes?
Okay.
So that we're right at the halftime, because people tend to tune back in to Zoom at exactly the time when a paper begins. So it's just a suggestion, Fiona.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah. So I suppose what we'll do is we'll take the speakers and then we'll have some Q&A at the end rather than interrupting people.
Yeah. Great idea.
Yeah, so that'll be pretty good. Now, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat if anybody wants to put anything into the chat that wants to make a comment. So I have to just check that everybody knows how to pronounce my name. It's Finola, like Coca-Cola. It's an Irish name.
I love that.
I have to say that to people when I used to go to I spent some time in Germany, so if anybody speaks German, I used to say Coca-Cola. Finola, it's Coca-Cola. So it's the only way to get it. It means fair-shouldered one. I'm in the history department here as a broadcast historian, so we're the first university in Ireland to actually have an undergraduate module on media and history. No other university does media and history. It was considered really beyond contemplation a few years ago. So we have a lot of students taking master's degrees in media history as well, which is
there's an interesting film studies, of course, is it's a media history is a big tent. So
yes, yeah. And I've also started looking towards the smaller screen, television.
Yes.
And I love radio, of course, as well, so so that's all very important here. So as I said, we're very, even though we're a peripheral nation, we're right sandwiched in between the Anglo-American culture. So it's really interesting to see how we evolve. So it's great to hear. I was at a session on the Media Commission recently, and there were complaints that Irish people don't consume enough international news. We just get the Washington correspondent on our RT television. We get a little bit about Brexit, but we really don't know what's happening in Germany, Czechoslovakia. If it's not on the 6 o'clock news in Ireland, nobody bothers with it.
Well, it would be a little off time, but we certainly should have people tune into this conference.
Yes, yeah, that's very true.
But anyway, I'd say my colleague Finola Doyle may indeed take over the podium as chair of this panel, broadcast historian in the School of History here at UCC, our host university for this conference. So thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, no problem. Very interesting. It's good to keep alert and to keep abreast of what's happening. So, Johana, just to tell our listeners that you are a PhD candidate at the University in Prague. And again, your paper looking at how Czechoslovakia tried to mute the news in 1938, which should be really, really fascinating. So if I'll turn off my camera, and maybe when the main speaker is speaking, we could turn off our cameras just to give them center stage. And our microphones as well, so that, and you can put into the chat. I think we're so fed up with being online that it's just nice to be able to focus on one person. So Johana, you have the stage.
Thank you very much, Finola, for the kind introduction. I will now try to share my screen with you. Hopefully it will work. Yes, so now you should be able to follow me. So thank you very much again for having me. I'm very excited for contributing a bit to this fascinating conference. As you suggested, Finola, I'm moving a little bit eastwards, and I'm taking us to Central Eastern Europe, concretely Czechoslovakia, with my paper. And as Ireland, I think, is sandwiched a little bit between America and Britain, like Czechoslovakia, or today Czech Republic is indeed sandwiched between the East and West. About this topic, actually, my presentation will be a lot. So that's just on a side note. Okay, so the paper is called Czechoslovak Media Scene in 1938, a lack of media-induced anxiety and the origins of the Munich Treason. Munich Agreement signed on the night from 29th to 30th September 1938 by Adolf Hitler, Edouard Daladier, Neville Chamberlain, and Benito Mussolini, represented one of the turning points on the way to World War II. It turned Czechoslovak borderland, which was mainly inhabited by Sudeten Germans, over to Nazi Germany, and became one of the most exciting news of the year, next to the Anschluss of Austria in March or Kristallnacht later in November. Its immediate impact had a limited geographical significance. However, in a long-term perspective, it marked the beginning of the general Western powers' withdrawal from Central Europe. This process, initiated in the late 1930s, was not to end until 10 years later, when a series of coups d'etats plunged the region into the iron embrace of Soviet Union. Yet the highly toxic notion of treason, or betrayal, if you want, which Czechs share, for example, with Poles, who were also to be abandoned, quote unquote, despite the binding treaty of alliance with France and, in its case, Britain, less than a year later, is firmly anchored in September 1938 and the months which preceded it. What historians call Munich treason or Munich betrayal has been repeatedly abused for political purposes in the last 8 years. It created a steady foundation for skepticism felt by wide public in regards to the moral integrity of the West, which seemed to be almost entirely stifled in the years of late socialism and early transformation, but alarmingly re-emerged in the last decade. Widespread Euroscepticism, stable support for populist parties, or reluctant stance towards condemnation of Putin's Russia can be interpreted as only some of the long shadows of what the rest of the world perceived as only one of the exciting news of 1938. The aim of this paper is to shed a light on the role media played in the birth of the Munich treason phenomenon. It argues that Czechs were not prepared for the hit of realpolitik, as the leading intellectuals of the time failed to analyze the international events which preceded September Accords realistically. The lack of West's action in reaction to the Anschluss of Austria or Franco's advancement in the Spanish Civil War ought to boost vigilance in regard to safety guarantees of Czechoslovakia. It did not, and when it did in the very last days before the meeting in Munich, it was already too late. The only voice on the media scene which defied the wishful thinking of liberal and conservative circles was systematically undermined for its presumed ideological bias. The official daily of Czechoslovak Communist Party, Rudé Právo, in English Red Justice, had indeed problems linked to its ideological orientation. However, the authenticity of its independent and often highly prophetic analysis cannot be denied. Its suppression did not serve good ends. Therefore, the paper claims that the lack of media-induced anxiety, which would normally represent the sign of sensible and prudent journalism, had actually disastrous ramifications in the case of interwar Czechoslovakia. The notion of Munich treason was later spread and strengthened by suddenly awakened anxiety-inducing media, respectively intellectuals who did not foresee what was coming in advance. The paper is divided into three main sections. First, it looks at the influence Czech intellectuals traditionally have on public opinion. From here, we deduce the relevance of the discursive practices present in the chosen media of 1938. Second, it examines two exciting news of 38, and it's particularly Anschluss of Austria and so-called Runciman mission from August 1938, and their analysis by liberal pro-governmental Lidové noviny, People's News in English, and as I mentioned already, Rudé Právo, Red Justice, as representative dailies. Interpretative problems of the comments are closely inspected. Third, the paper sheds light on the post-September bitterness and anxiety the media helped to shape, spread, and finally get anchored on the mental maps of Czechs. The borders between political and cultural activity are traditionally blurred in the Czech contexts. The roots of the setting can be traced back to 17th century, as Bradley Abrams rightly points out. At the time, the ruling strata in both the secular and religious life came to be perceived as ethnically and religiously foreign. After the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, the country was subdued by Habsburgs and subjected to rigorous counter-reformation. 2 centuries later, the national revival was initiated by writers, linguists, and scholars who filled the space occupied in other countries by aristocracy. The cultural elite slowly transformed into political elite at the turn of the 20th century and strongly affected the institutional character of the First Republic formed after World War I. The system heavily relied on authority of its founding father Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, philosopher, sociologist, and scholar by profession. Even though the interwar Czechoslovakia is rightly known as the only Central Eastern European democracy which lasted until World War II, it is important to outline its limits. Nevertheless, the extra constitutional power centers influenced the political life of the First Republic. First, the so-called Pětka, the Five, comprised of leaders of 5 strongest political parties, which with the exception of 3 years, ruled the country as a coalition for 20 years. Second, Hrad, the castle, according to the seat of Czech kings and later presidents, centered around Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, who served as a Minister of Foreign Affairs before becoming president, mainly controlled country's foreign policy, which was since the beginning oriented towards the Western powers. Both extra constitutional power centers were significantly diminishing possibilities of alternative political streams. Communist Party was not abolished, unlike in other Central Eastern European countries. However, its reputation was constantly undermined. Similarly, voices calling for caution in reliance on France and Britain or calling for an alternative alignment were blunted by the halo surrounding the guardians of the castle. Daily Lidové noviny examined by this paper are called by Andrea Orzov the flagship newspaper of the First Republic and Prague's Le Monde. Their chief commentators were Masaryk's adherents, and as we will see, they continued to be loyal to the castle's political line even after his death. The well-known connection between the President Liberator, as Masaryk was soon nicknamed, and intellectuals publishing in Lidové noviny such as Ferdinand Peroutka, Hubert Rybka, Karel Čapek, or Ivo Ducháček bestowed on them the authority of their master. The daily circulation of the paper oscillated around 90,000 copies in the late 1930s. The official paper of the Communist Party, Rudé Právo, had comparable number of daily copies at the time, some 80,000. Let's move now to the actual comparative analysis of the exciting news of 1938 as captured by the 2 periodicals. The annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany on 13 March caused an uproar around the world. Czech newspapers primarily focused on the reaction of France and Britain, as their position could indicate their stance to Hitler's future attempts of territorial expansion to the east. A careful condemnation of the British Secretary of State, Edward Halifax, was in few days followed by scandalous words of conservative politician Lennox Boyd on the floor of Parliament, who declared that there would be nothing more laughable than to guarantee the borders of Czechoslovakia. Even though Neville Chamberlain immediately denied that the government shared such views, the affair was open for interpretation. On 16 March, Jan Mincer wrote in a reaction to the development on British political scene for Lidové noviny that, quote, England will never give us a guarantee of friendship, but we already have something far more binding, an awareness of its interest in us, end of the quote. 3 days later, Czechs could read in the same paper that, quote, not only in France, but also in the Anglo-Saxon world, they understand that just as they could not allow the destruction of Serbia or Belgium, they cannot afford losing such an important position of their own as Czechoslovakia. In the last few days, we have been admitted by the Great Britain into its company, to its great peaceful and democratic club with a long, beautiful tradition. They are used to good manners there, end of the quote. The final punch came from Ferdinand Peroutka. He commented on Chamberlain's speech from 24 February, in which the chief proponent of appeasement repeated that Britain's main interest is to preserve peace, but it is ready to stick to its commitments. The self-confidence and the impression of infallibility of Peroutska's tone is unfortunately typical for the foreign affairs comments Lidové noviny published at the time. Quote, laymen are unable to judge the meaning of Chamberlain's words, nor are all those that a foolish publisher chose to run a newspaper. Their meaning can be judged only by those who study the methods of British foreign policy at least a little bit. The word of our homeland is unable to understand that the quiet voice of a British Prime Minister, even his whisper, has far greater influence than loud cries in the papers. End of the quote. On contrary, Rudé Právo offered a much more balanced evaluation of Lennox Boyd's utterance. On 24th March, it wrote that he only interpreted, quote, only interpreted in a drastic and undiplomatic way the stance of a group of Hitler-sympathizing lords who influenced Chamberlain's government, end of the quote. On the account of Chamberlain's speech, Rudé Právo wrote, quote, if Mr. Chamberlain does not mind the terrible destruction and slaughter of Spanish cities when he makes gentlemanly agreements with those whose planes do the destruction, then Europe will be always in danger of new aggression and violence, and there will be no real peace for us or for anybody else in Europe, end of the quote. The general skepticism regarding the preparedness of the Western powers to intervene in favor of Czechoslovakia was, however, often wrongly complemented by counting on public opinion of British workers, which communist intellectuals assumed to be on the side of intervention. As we know, nothing was farther from truth. The protests against the British neutral position in the Spanish matters or its participation in the Munich Agreement were rather symbolic. The second exciting news we will have a look at concerned Czechoslovakia and its escalating conflict with Sudeten Germans led by Konrad Henlein. In summer 1938, Czechoslovak government accepted the mission of the special British envoy, Lord Runciman, who was supposed to mediate between the two parties. Liberal intellectuals trust in the best intentions of Runciman, who spent most of his free time in company of Nazi-sympathizing German aristocrats and arrogantly overlooked Czech as well as international journalists, was not disrupted for a moment. In Lidové noviny, they welcomed, quote, the courier of British liberal democracy, end of the quote, while specifically emphasizing his objectivity and democratic conviction. Respected writer Jan Drda relied on comparisons between Woodrow Wilson and Runciman and made the readership sure that the, quote, old gentleman of the noble features is aware of his mission's gravity, end of the quote. The highly idealistic prism was complemented by a parade of Anglophilic stereotypes. Runciman was even praised for his choice of transport. Train represented safe advancement, typical for the British approach. His seriousness was tinged by usual British humor, as they said. Deda finished his commentary pathetically proclaiming that, quote, when we see his grey head and his most beautiful eyes, which have remained sparkling with brilliance and decisiveness for over 60 years, we believe, end of the quote. It is hard to imagine that readers of Lidové noviny could anticipate how things will evolve only 2 months later, as they were continuously presented with the rosiest pictures of international and now also domestic events. We can only guess how much the once again critical voice of Rudé Právo resonated in the population. The paper promptly described the mission as an unacceptable intervention into domestic affairs and warned that it was most probably initiated by Hitler himself as a cover-up. The extent of criticism the paper could publish was already then limited by censorship, as Eduard Ursks mentions in his article from 8th August. Rudé Právo was abolished totally 3 weeks after Munich Agreement was signed. And I get to the end now. In the morning of 30th September 1938, the logics of the multi-layered construction of visions Czechs were taught to believe in during the last 20 years collapsed. It was decided that the country will accept the decision of powers and renounce the border territories without fight. The blame was immediately directed towards treacherous allies. Any kind of self-criticism was rare for a long time if it was present at all. The foundation for the Munich treason myth was already being laid in the immediate aftermath. Most of the articles Lidové noviny published in the first weeks after Munich is dominated by grief imbued by pathos. However, we can also encounter comments characterized by irony and sarcasm. To illustrate this evolution, we can briefly mention 2 examples. A mere week after Munich, in Lidové noviny, we could read on account on the British quote-unquote ex-friends. Their songs, pictures, and books seem a tad too selfish to us now. Their thoughts seem dishonest and false. Their words would taste bitterly in our mouths. End of the quote. According to him, to them, Czechs needed a break from Brits. He advised instead to focus on themselves. On a more sarcastic note, calls for removal of shop signs in foreign languages emerged, specifically signs in French and English. Quote, we understand, of course, that a distinguished Englishman who knows nothing about the country he graced with his presence cannot be bothered with such simple task like a simple Czech servant, end of the quote, suggesting that Czechs should not make it simple for the foreigners as they themselves don't have it simple abroad. The example of Czech media scene in 1938 proves that words on their own don't have meanings, similarly as the exciting news don't have meanings on their own. Those are only inserted into them by those who either pronounce or announce them or interpret them. Czech intellectuals filled the meanings of the words uttered by the Western statesmen as well as the portraits of the Western powers by imagined constructions they needed to rationalize their own life, which was inherently linked to the existence of Czechoslovakia. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to question session later. We can't hear you, Finola, I'm afraid.
Oh, now you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great, super altogether. And again, very interesting idea of the notion of kind of gatekeeping and becoming the population. So we're going to stay with Eastern Europe, and we're moving to a culturalist historian now, Jakub Machek. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Jakub, welcome to Ireland, online, albeit. And also, Jakub is in the Department of Media Studies at the Metropolitan University of Prague, and he's also author of The Emergence of Popular Culture in the Czech Lands. So his paper, I suppose, updates us a little bit. We move forward to 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and we continue to take a look at this as kind of post-occupation level of maybe in some way controlling the media and becalming, again, readership. So it's very interesting. So we're staying with anxiety-inducing the sort of the attempt to keep, I suppose, in a way, readers complicit and accepting a certain narrative. So I'm really looking forward to this. So thank you very much, Jakub.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I would add that I'm not presenting alone here. Also, my colleague Ondřej Daniel would present you the second part of our presentation. I will just try to share it. Okay, almost. Okay. Could you see my presentation, please?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. So we will now move about 30 years forward to another occupation. In fact, it's a quite popular Czech narrative about different occupations and defeats and losses caused by someone else all the time. Now we are probably in the middle of some another one. But now me and my colleague want to present something about the late socialist Czechoslovak society and the way how the media treated the anxiety and excitement and fear and other issues related to this conference, because we think that this is some kind of the distinctive feature of the late socialist media, with the strong effort to avoid the inducing of anxiety within the society. In fact, the media tried to avoid anything threatening or unsettling to the audience, which applies mostly to the 1970s, which I'm going to talk about, and a bit different approach only slowly changed during the 1980s. And with the last 5 years of the perestroika period, it was the task for the Ondřej on the second half of this presentation. So I will start with the new regime, which was installed after the 1968 invasion, which ended the so-called Prague Spring, the short period of the liberalization of the regime. And after the, let's say, 1 year, maybe a few years of the relative freedom, the new regime tried to placate the public and prevent any kind of the free development. And it was related to the resignation of any attempt to mobilize people in the building of socialism, contrary to the 1950s. The most important things the regime wanted was the demand for quiet, peaceful life and the need for calm in order for the works to be undisturbed. As the head of the Communist Party, Gustav Husák, said in his speech about 4 or 5 years after the occupation, our party, during 4 short years, supported by millions of workers, has led society to the present quiet, and I should say sunny days, in which we can think about current problems without dangers or worries about tomorrow or next week. And the same thing was happening in the media, only just showing these sunny days and quiet life, peaceful life. So after the short freedom of speech, period of freedom of speech of this 1968, the media started to be closely controlled again. The production of in the media was planned in accordance with current ideological needs. And contrary to the 1950s, the propagandistic effort was shifted to the sphere of the popular culture. So the popular culture and the mainstream media was in the same time highly popular among audience, and in the same time it was ordered and controlled by the authorities very closely. And as I said, one of the most important demands for the media from the authorities was to avoid topics related to anything threatening or unsettling, as the disorder and the chaos was associated with the previous 1960s more liberal regime. So I will show you some examples how the media did this kind of threatening, exciting, and anxiety moments. I will start with some newspapers and with probably the biggest mass murder in the Czech post-war history. It's the the case of Olga Hepnerová, who in 1973 killed 8 people with a truck at a tram stop in Prague, in the capital of Czechoslovakia. She was the last woman sentenced to death. And in fact, this case was mostly abandoned by the media, and it was just only staying in the collective memory, who perpetuating this crime only in rumors about it in some different verses and so on. But in the last about last decade, it started to be popular again. Let's say in the media, it was some book written, film shot, and there also exists some theater play about Olga Hepnerová. But if you look what was in the news in the days after this accident, we can find only a brief and neutral report of this accident. I will present you, which was published in the Rudé Právo, Justice, the organ newspaper of the Communist Party, the most read newspaper of that time. In the middle of this newspaper, there was a short report with the headline, "Tragic Consequences of a Road Accident." It started with the sentence, "Tuesday afternoon, the female driver was unable to control a lorry and drove into the pedestrians waiting for a tram." After that, there is the depiction how the rescue workers trying to help the people, and these 2 paragraphs report ended with the last sentence, "The causes of the accident are being investigated." Next day, there was a bit more detailed report with the headline, "More to the tragic road accident." There was details about age of the driver, that there was the information that no alcohol or drugs were involved in this accident, but there was nothing, again, about the conscious planned act of Olga Hepnerová. Also, she sent an explanatory letter to newspapers before she did this mass murder. So you can see how this kind of, I would say, in the more liberal times, and more in the society with freedom of the press, would be the breaking news. In this media, this was somehow treated as something unimportant, something which could happen just by chance, nothing which is planned. This is the example from the newspapers. And the other my examples are from audiovisual media, which is connected with the films and TV shows. The typical genre showing crime are the crime TV shows, which were very popular in the Czechoslovak TV. Just the first popular one, the Hříšní lidé města Pražského, the Sinful People of Prague from the late 1960s, and with the subsequent 5 films shot during early 1970s, the crime was situated somehow out of this socialized society. It was happening during the interwar period. It was nostalgic. It was somehow the criminalist, and also all these murders was poetized. So they do not evoke a feeling of danger in the audience because it was something happening in the past, in fact, in the capitalist past. The same situation was with the popular Western Europe TV series, as the British Professionals or the Italian The Octopus. Again, the crime was situated outside the Czechoslovak society, outside the socialist society, to the west. It was related to the mafia, terrorism, drugs, which was this way depicted as something happening behind the Iron Curtain. And Iron Curtain is, in fact, protecting Czech people and Slovak people from these dangerous things. So we can compare like these dangerous things happening in the West and the domestic peace when there's nothing important, dangerous happening. It was not true, but in the media it was depicted this way. And this third crime TV show, the most propagandistic one, called 30 případů Maja Zemana, 30 Cases of Major Zeman. It was a propagandistic piece showing the achievement of the communist police during all the socialist era from 1940s to 1970s. The episodes were mostly inspired by the real cases, but again, also these crimes was happening in the Czechoslovak society. There was somehow again shift outside the socialist society, because it was mostly caused by the immigrants, capitalists, church officials, and other people, which we could call like the people of the past, people of the capitalist era. And the most important was the effort on the ability of the police to solve these cases and restore the order to protect the Czech or Slovak people. And the last episode was from the 1970s. And also in these cases, these crimes was set outside the society because it was caused by the dissidents and the youth affected by the 1968 chaos in the period speeches, how the Prague Spring was called. So again, it was some kind of warning of the disruption and disorder associated with the events of the Prague Spring. And that was highlighted the desire for peace to the work of the majority of the population. Just two more examples. There was the Prime TV series, which was more like soap opera style. It was the most popular genre of that time, watched sometimes by the 90% of TV audience. One of the examples is the Okres na Severu, the district in the north, depicting the life of the local communist authority who's trying to find a solution to the chemical plant explosion. But again, it started after the explosion, so the explosion is not depicted, and concern is on the way how to solve this explosion, how to start the fabric and its production again. So it's a kind of the purely economic question or maybe political question, and there is a strong emphasis on the rational solution of the problem. The same in another Prime TV series, Sanitka the Ambulance, from the 1980s. There is the last episode, which are capturing a real event when a Yugoslav plane crashed near the Prague in 1975. But again, the plane crash is not depicted, and emphasis on the capabilities of commandant of the rescue workers who are able rationally organized the event and save the lives. So there are several examples of the depiction how this any kind of the disasters and unwanted events was treated by the Czechoslovak media. Just very shortly, last one is youth musical films from the 1970s. In fact, there is the tradition of youth musical films in Czech cinematography depicting the generation gap. But in this case, in the 1970s, there was no generation gap in this movie. There is no conflict, no tension, no different values between the generation cohorts, and all the generation fully understand problems of youth and enthusiastically helps them. So we see the ideal depiction of the 1970s from the point of view of the communist authorities. There's the conflict-free society with its core of life satisfaction in an affluent life free of conflicts and threats. That's end of my part, and I will turn the word for Ondřej.
Yes, hello. I'll try to add a couple of words also for the remaining of the socialist or late state socialist period. It means from the, say, from the first third of the 1980s until the very end of, let's say, the socialist socialism in Czechoslovakia. We can put it this way. So Jakub stopped sharing. I will start sharing. Let us see how this works. And I think you can see my first slide, I hope, which is about the violence in the public sphere. So actually, we are moving on a trajectory from, let's say, the calm 1970s.
Sorry for interrupting you, Danny. Would you just briefly introduce yourself there, because I should have done that. Just briefly say.
Okay, I will do that. So my name is Ondřej, and I'm working as a historian at Charles University Prague at the Faculty of Arts, and my concern is basically on the subcultures and popular culture of the late state socialism and early post-socialism. Okay. So this is also what I will be speaking about. And as I said, I will try to illustrate this trajectory from the 1970s, let's say, order and calm, delimited by the socialist legality, And until the 1990s, the period of on the one side, let's say the liberation, but on the other side also that can be characterized as a return of the violence into the public sphere. So what was in between, let's say, since the first third of the 1980s, we can say that there is a change in understanding of the anxiety and violence in the Czechoslovak media. And I will, as I put some buzzwords that we took from, let's say, our teacher, Michal Pullman. Of course, we cannot say that there was no violence at all in public sphere of the 1970s, because definitely there was this displaced violence. There was a systemic violence, for example, against Roma women being sterilized forcibly, and so on and so forth. The civilized violence, okay, the violence was hidden, but there was violence for sure. Nevertheless, and it is somehow also in this auto-stereotype of the Czech society, the Czechs, especially Slovaks, a little bit less, consider themselves as a pacifist nation, as a dove nation. So let's say the revolt or the revolution in 1989, the so-called Velvet Revolution, also bore this meeting, which was very pacifistic. And let's say the mobilizing wars where they beat our children. It means the state police or the riot squads in November 1989 that suppressed the students' relatively pacific, again, manifestation. Very forcibly, they were criticized. So this beating of our children finally meant mobilizations of last course of the big course of the Czech society and the end of state socialism. So how did we get there? I will be briefly speaking about the perestroika stage. Means since, let's say, the 1986, 1987, there was a big debate, especially in the media, but also with some links to the police and to the legal system that thematized juvenile delinquency. It was definitely pretty much linked with the subcultures. And I put here some pictures. First, you can see as just let's say illustration about time-lapsing documentaries that started to be shot with this specific sociological interest into the youth. And you can see a long-haired guy being married at the Prague town square, and which was not definitely seen as a problem, but it was interesting for the people, as you can see those ladies observing the couple from behind. And I don't need to translate brutalita and memento, because I believe it is basically understandable. The first book is about violence. The second one was about drugs. So this is something which started to be more and more thematized in the public sphere since, let's say, 1983, 1984. And it is interesting that in most of these topics, it was in particular training laborers. So it means the young or the youth that was learning in these vocational trainings, being future workers, that were particularly demonized. They were depicted as those being the most violent, and I will try to show you also why. So it is also interesting that one of these topics was in 1986 was rose by Foreign Review of Press, which was called 100+1, and among others, there were the shocking news, as Jakub has shown, from the West, saying that in the West everything is rotten and the people hang themselves because they are unemployed, and so on and so forth. But it also brought the first information about skinheads in the 1980s in Czechoslovakia. And it is interesting that those information, since they were meant to be shocking, inspired, let's say, the first wave of the young people who started to listen to oi and punk music, started to shave their heads, and started to mimic the racism of the working class subculture as they understood it from the West. Another one was a 1987 movie that was shot based on real life events in 1985, where hooligans linked with Sparta Prague vandalized the train and were harnessing also some of its passengers. And it was basically also this kind of mimicking of the violence wave at the British stadiums. It is interesting that most of these chants they were using were chanting Brussels, Brussels, which is not in Britain, obviously, but it is linked with the tragedy at the Hazel Stadium in May 1985, when British fans collapsed or started the hooligan battle with the Italian fans, and there were several dozens of fans dead. So this is something which was seen as a really shocking news, and it was reported as such by the socialist media, where at the same time the Sparta Prague hooligans understood it as a something which is basically bringing them to the battle. So it was again this mobilizing slogan. So as you can see, just in front of you, I'm repeating this main point: the sociology and film interest linked together with the exploitation cinema, again inspired with the wave of 1980s Italian movies in particular. And what is interesting, this moral panic also continued around the film premiere in 1987, where again at the Prague or the Central Prague-based cinema, the young trainees, the trainee laborers, started to vandalize the cinema itself. So it's again the life after life of the movie. So the first point is that most of this anxiety-free Czechoslovak media started to introduce the information from the West, and but it wasn't only the West; it was also other countries from the former Soviet bloc. So you can see on the pictures in front of you some pictures shot from the festival in Jarocin in Poland in the half of the 1986, where again the subcultures, of course, global subcultures already were asking posing the problems for the socialist regimes, because such things were supposed to be reserved for the West. Again, maybe it's even more surprising, the debate since Glasnost and Perestroika started to integrate quite a lot the critique of the late state socialism and its sociological aspects, especially in the Soviet Union. So on the picture just in front of me is Viktor Tsoi, the singer of Kino, rock band of the Soviet Union that became very popular and became a model for the Soviet counterculture in the final parts of its period. Nevertheless, let's say this east to east cultural transfer was, let's say, much less important for the Czech case because of the image of the Soviet culture as such, and it was only let's say the partial, which was basically negative, and it was only a partial one. So to conclude, there is we can say the hegemony of anxiety-free model started to erode with Perestroika, definitely. But in the same time, we cannot say that one replaced the other. So in the same time, there existed the anxiety-free Czechoslovak media, and the films were shot, the news were issued according to this model. But in the same time, simultaneously, new kind of narrative started to be reproduced, which, as I put here, is probably tried to reconstruct the society along the socialist lines. It could have used the sociological interest I was speaking about, but also it tried to put the shocking information to frighten and to toughen, so to toughen the socialist dictator. Definitely, we can see that the generational revolt and the generational issue started to be more and more important. And I think it's for the discussion if there are these unintended consequences of the panic news items and films, as I was trying to show. And definitely, I would like to follow up on the marvelous keynote speech we heard yesterday. If there is a collective consciousness, or maybe a zeitgeist, as we would say in the German, inspired parts of Europe as a historical force. So this is it from me. Thanks a lot.
Okay, that was really interesting. It just flooded back some memories about how Northern Ireland was depicted, and Margaret Thatcher talking about a policy of containment, and nothing bad was to be reported from Northern Ireland until eventually the slow drip of exposure. So we've got a question. Will we wait until our next two speakers? So we're moving to Russia.
May I just interject here that we actually have one more speaker, because let's say Mr. Twold has called in sick. So, right.
So, okay, so we're still moving to Russia despite that.
Indeed.
Now, this one should be really interesting for somebody, for me anyway in particular, the notion of looking at Irish republicanism and music. So we're moving now to Dr. Maria-Valeria Morris, who's an anthropologist and folklorist. Welcome. And you're based in Moscow. And so this is going to be really fascinating, because you want to take a look at the portrayal of radical Irish republicanism and Irish rebel music, which is really going to be fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to that, and maybe having a quick chat afterwards regarding the content of your paper. So I will mute myself there. Do you like to be called Mary?
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, Mary. Okay, very good. Okay, right, I'll come off that there. Okay.
So thank you very much for the kind welcome, and I'm very happy to be a part of this conference today. Now, just a second. I'll share my screen. Does it work? Does everyone?
Lovely,
see?
yeah.
Oh, great. So this presentation is based on the research that was originally intended, and still is intended, to be a part of a larger research project dedicated to conceptualization and perception of contemporary radical Republican community in Ireland from the point of view of symbolic resistance as put by James Scott, with an emphasis on non-militant practices and community building, community help, etc. And of course, in this particular case, this was the practices of listening to and or performing rebel music, because the listener and the performer, when we speak about folk music or what can be spoken about as urban folklore, urban folk culture, the lines between the listener and the performer, they can sometimes get blurry. I feel I should say a couple of words about the methodology of my research and the maintaining of anonymity of my respondents. Well, of course, I understand that ideally and, well, basically, an actual offline field trip, and more than one field trip, is in order here, but then, as everybody knows, the virus happened. So I had to deal with digital ethnography. So my respondents from the Irish Republican community were both presumably militant activists and non-militant activists, and therefore I had to develop two frameworks of actual data collection and data assessment. As far as my respondents of more militant persuasion are concerned, I maintained online anonymous contact via Telegram, and I arranged for sending a list of questions to a person, and this person arranged spreading the questions the word further, and I got all in all 10 written questionnaires, 10 written answers to my questions, and I promised to destroy the photos as soon as I type in the text, and that was what I did. Speaking of non-military respondents, there was just proper email and or phone interviews, so the procedure was much simpler. And of course, I understand that there might be a question raised of whether my respondents, the invisible part of them, were exactly those who they were presumed to be. or maybe I was pranked or something. And while I cannot give a yes or no, I believe that since even an alleged allegiance to a certain organization is criminalized, I think that's a bit of an overkill and a little too much a cause for pranking some anthropologist from Moscow. So I chose to believe them. And of course, I'm planning on online fieldwork and participant observation of community help and community building in the Republican community in the post-COVID future, which hopefully will come. So first, a couple of words about what exactly is Irish rebel music in my understanding as far as this piece of research is concerned. And I'm drawn heavily on the works by Richard Parfitt and Stephen Miller here. And I would draw the boundaries of this term via textual conventions. And according to some consensus existing on the matter in folkloristics and in nationalist folk music studies, there are some common textual conventions that basically constitute rebel music, those of commemoration of previous iteration of the struggle and outlining continuity between the events of the past and the contemporary struggle. Then second point, narratives of some heroic self-sacrifice and Republican martyrdom, which, as should also be noted, take special prominence since the hunger strike. And third, last but not least, struggle for the social justice in general, not limited to specifically Irish discourse. I should also note that instrumentalization and pragmatics of rebel music in Irish Republican history was not uniform and was developing and evaluating gradually. And initially, rebel music was not perceived as an act of defiance per se, with individual exceptions, of course. For example, in 1962 in Galerin, I hope I'm pronouncing it all right because I only have knowledge of Old Irish and late Middle Irish. So, but basically in these debates, a TD was very stressed with a classmate of his own son who knew and sang a song commemorating South, and the speaker considered that an outrage and a threat to the status quo. But all in all, despite James Conley himself suggesting promotion of rebel music, it was not instrumentalized as some performative action, as some resistance action. But with the growing physicality of the conflict in the North, music started to play an increasingly important role as an antagonizing factor. So in the end, both listening to and performing rebel music came to be interpreted as an act of rebellion in its own right by all parties of the conflict, including the state. But one could say that, well, this is a matter of time's long past, and what importance, what practical and political importance could this hold now? But, well, here is a list, a very short part of a quite a longer list of precedents of rebel songs making headlines. And among these media cases, we can see first the case when a song by the Wolftones was pulled from Aer Lingus flights after a complaint from a passenger who found it sectarian and demanded for the song to not be played on the flights anymore. Then in 2018, the singer Rod Stewart claimed that he was actually banned from singing the song Grace on BBC, and while he said that he meant it to be sung just as a proper love song, the history of the song, the allusions to Republican history, that's what considered to actually have it banned. And the last two cases are, I believe, of a special interest here because they all relate to the very recent election when a song by Tom Celtic Symphony was played, Celtic Symphony, yes, because it's related to a football club, was played from a Sinn Féin election band and was later also sang by a TD, and this was also deemed sectarian by the press and called considerable media outrage. And then also in 2020, also during the election campaign, another series of headlines. The song Kamati Black and Tans was sang at protests against Black and Tans commemorations and was also sang by Sinn Féin supporters. And this was also seen as sectarian by the press and also seen as a threat and caused some media outrage. And basically, we can see that the same corpus, the same repertoire of pretty much famous songs that are all in all very well known to the public, both in Ireland and abroad, I say, exists in two frameworks simultaneously. I think we could dub this two framework as mainstream republicanism, people who support the Good Friday Agreement and support the current peace process and effectively consider the war over, and hardline pro-armed struggle republicanism. And if we are talking about the official, the mainstream Republican discourse, the rebel songs are seen as historical material within it and are not regarded as a relevant political commentary. Therefore, they can safely exist in designated spaces, for example, pubs, concert venues, etc., and not be seen as sectarian as when they're sang in these venues, but will be labeled so if crossing into mainstream spaces, because media backlash in all those cases, in all those articles that were related to the incidents on the previous slide, well, here they are again, it concentrated not on the song per se, which was usually well known anyways, but on the inappropriate setting in which it was performed or played out. Therefore, rebel music events are not utilized in any tangible fashion and are remaining when they're happening in a designated space, in an appropriate setting, a purely recreational activity in the mind, in the perception of the audience. On the other hand, in the more radical Republican community, the rebel songs are seen as a relevant narrative and a means of transmitting the current cultural message to future generations. Therefore, there is also a matter of special marked designated spaces that are associated with rebel musical events, but the presence in such spaces often constitutes a symbolic act of rebellion per se. And last but not least, in this discourse, the music events, the music gigs are also utilized as, for example, community help initiatives. I attended 2 such events during my online fieldwork, and both of them were fundraisers. The first was a fundraiser for the homeless, and the second was a fundraiser for a hospital, for a hospice in Glasgow. And while concentrating on this second discourse, I was asking my respondents about why they consider rebel music to be so relevant, why do they consider it to be important, and essentially which functions does it still perform in the community, in the in-group perception. Some of the responses that I received, they were pretty much in line with what Dr. Parfit and Dr. Miller write in their books, and so which is basically the academic consensus on the matter. Of course, the transmission of identity, then education, then commemoration, and what was especially important and especially relevant here is that not only song material per se is considered as an act of commemoration, but the very act of listening to rebel songs is seen as an act of commemoration, and with that also an act of rebellion. That direct quote from one of my respondents. But the fourth function that was very well pronounced was something that was related to the media portrayal of the radical Republican community directly. It was quite a surprise to me but a lot of my respondents, they spoke of a very well reflected stigma. And here on this slide, there are just 2 quotes from a longer list that relate to that problem. And rebel music, especially listening to rebel music or singing rebel music, was conceptualized by my respondents as a means of sustaining oneself morally and of combating the stigma, which can become also quite personal. And in the end of the slide, there is another quote from an interview, which I honestly do find quite heartbreaking. And I even had some doubt whether I should include it into my research in the personal nature. But as I got, as I was allowed by the respondent to do so, so here it is. The importance of rebel music is combating the media stigma, the media backlash, according to my respondents, is utilized, is performed according to the following patterns. First of all, the very act of listening to or performing a rebel song, what is constituted a rebel song within the tradition, does not just allude to active rebellion, but according to in-group perception, is in fact active rebellion, as it automatically means sustaining a prosecuted and heavily stigmatized identity. And what was rather surprising to me, and what went in contrast and in contrary, for example, with the findings of Dr. Miller, is that the addressee of the rebel music message in this context was not some outgroup character that needed to be radicalized, or someone who needs to be reinforced in their opinions, but an in-group listener and performer who was forming an inner narrative to maintain dignity and resilience. And another quote from the handouts I received is basically here on this slide. There were more quotes like this, but the common denominator was that all of the in-group respondents, they considered music and the act of listening to music as not just and not mainly as some community performance, some community act, but a very personal act, and that was integrated into a very personal narrative. And returning to the function of education, because the musical tradition, the textual tradition of the rebel music was very much seen as a means of education and education in history by my respondents. This was, again, pretty much in line with the academic consensus on the matter, but this educational aspect was also seen first and foremost as a means of uncensored education, which was once again contrasted to public discourse stigma. And here you can see 2 more quotes from the fieldwork. Again, the especially characteristic one is that if you listen, if you learn something, it's a victory already. So basically, if we go over these patterns again, we can see a common denominator, a common pattern. First of all, the consideration of the rebel music, the textual canon, which is pretty much the same for quite a number of years. Because when I attended those online gigs and I watched the recordings of offline gigs, I noted that the repertoire, it's pretty stable, and sometimes it is adapted to the current reality, to the current events, but this is just some normal small tweaks of the text and not just writing a total new song material. This is still a variation on the very same canon. But this canon being put in a specific space, both in a space in the physical sense, some marked location, and in the space in the sense of a communicative act, becomes actualized as an actual, well, too many words that are derived from the act and actual, sorry. Well, the performativity of this music as an act of symbolic resistance is in direct connection first with the context and with the framework within which it is performed. And the very same repertoire, the very same song can be actually an act of resistance or not an act of resistance, depending on the space and on the communication situation, and more first and foremost on the discourse, on the in-group discourse within which it is taking place, the performance is taking place. And the second point was that as far as in-group radical Republican performers and perception of rebel music is concerned, one of the key pragmatic functions would be in-group countering and personal countering of out-group media anti-Republican stigma, both on state media and sadly on interpersonal levels. And to cut a long story short, I think there is a clear correlation. The more media backlash, the more pronounced the symbolic resistance aspect becomes, which is once again completely in line with Scott's theory and pretty much adds up. So I guess I don't know if I fit into the minutes, but I guess it's likely that's all from me for today, and I will be very happy to answer questions and detail something further. And sorry, I was quite nervous.
You were super, well done. Now you can put on as many of your cameras as you wish so that we can have a little bit of interaction. Brendan, do you have a question? Is that who's the question? If you put up your hand, I can see maybe who, or you can just wave if you can wave if you've got a question. Brendan, do you have a question?
Actually, I did. I was actually applauding, but I did have a couple of questions / comments, if I may.
Sure.
This is certainly an exciting and a deep panel. There's an enormous amount going on here, and we're talking about experiences that are within the memory of many of us here, and some of us have been closer or further away from those events that are being talked about. But there are a couple of hugely important, I'd say, larger issues in regard to media studies in general that may well apply not only to this time period of late 20th century, but also to some of the previous periods that we've been discussing. Interestingly, in the discussions so far regarding early modern period and so on, we haven't dealt that much with the, you might say, the wider methodological, structural, theoretical issues yet. But what I see being raised in the papers in this panel is a couple of very fundamental questions that are sometimes taken for granted, I think, in media studies of earlier periods, partly because the philological concerns of just uncovering the material are so overwhelming that sometimes getting down to the serious business of theoretically analyzing what it is we're doing sometimes seems a little bit out of reach. There's so much effort being spent on simply gathering the information. But one question which seems simple but is not is what in fact does the media do, or do the media do in any society? And there are many positions on this. There's the sort of democratic theory, there's the totalitarian theory, and but then another theory that occurred to me, especially in Ondřej's slides and in Jakub's presentation, the soothing effect. I wanted to think of the soothing effect of media as not only applying to Czechoslovakia in that time period that they're talking about, but rather in, well, I hesitate to say it, but in all times, in a way, media do provide a way of digesting experience. I mean, experience is always is very often pretty scary. I mean, the risks of life in earlier times are not to be underestimated, from childbirth, from warfare around the country, around the world. Your city could be besieged at any moment. Natural disasters which can't be dealt with, famines, disease for which there is no knowledge of what a cure could be, or any of these things are happening all the time. And so what does the media do in situations like this? Does it inform? But we've seen that in so many contexts, it doesn't really inform. It's actually uttering a lot of very weird things that sometimes, well, informing would be a very strong word for what the media is doing sometimes. So that rather, are we actually indeed talking about media which may in some ways help in dealing with experience? And the person I was thinking of, the media theorist I was thinking of, is Edgar Morin, the structuralist theory, the notion that societies are built upon these structures, just as I suppose the world of microphysics and the world of microbiology are based on structures that must continue. And the media, in some ways, according to Morin's work called La Méthode, in his model, the media function for making sure that the structure somehow works a little more smoothly than it otherwise would, so that people are able to deal with what they have to deal with. So that's one question I wanted to raise. The other remarkable insight, which I saw from Maria Morris's intervention, is the notion of the relation between, and this may be related to the notion that I just mentioned, but the idea of media and personality. What an amazing theme. And so media becomes a part of self-identity and self-identification. And so the directing oneself towards one form of media or one media output as opposed to another media output. I mean, we have seen in East and West in those past times, and presently in our current media world, effects of media and conspiracy theorists kind of aspects creating cultural subgroups. So we have kind of cultural subgroups with a group identity of themselves as being somehow the bearers of a media investigation that has brought some secret knowledge to them that makes them special and gives them a sense of being the bearers of an ideology or a political reality. I'm thinking of the Proud Boys in the United States, okay? So these are sort of fragment groups which are motivated by media, but the media has become their self-definition. So media as self-definition or contributing to self-definition and personality, hugely important theme that I think we who are working on earlier periods would want to play with a little more than we do.
Thanks, Brendan. So just distill that down. It is very interesting about the whole notion of gatekeeping, you know, and like who defines the news, and you know, and if I could just ask one question, two questions I want to ask, and then I'll bring everybody else in. I'm just fascinated, Jakub in particular, you know, with Eva Heprapanova, how do they avoid her? How do they avoid not discussing her hanging in this 1975? She was the last woman to be hanged in Czechoslovakia. which was a huge media event in itself, a huge public media event. How, you know, so we can call it what we want, but was this a blatant form of censorship? Was it a blatant form of, as you say, kind of like soothing the media, and the idea that this was a woman as well engaged in a crime that would have really devastated the whole ideology of the becalming effort? Has there been a lot written on it in terms of what were their media? You just turn on, yeah.
Unfortunately, I haven't checked it. It's my fault, but I haven't checked what was happening in the media during the sentence. So I don't know, but probably it was also the short notice somewhere in the newspapers, in the middle of newspapers, and it was did in the another occasions. But unfortunately, I haven't checked it.
Yeah, no, I just thought that would be, because it was such an explosive event, you know, a woman to be, and just one other one, Mary, that I want to just ask you, do you think that the sort of the rebel music that you're talking about and the appropriation of it for political purposes, that has been kind of diluted over it's been diluted because it's become commodified? You know, the people like the, you know, very popular musicians like the Clancys in America and a lot of Irish groups, that it's no longer got the same resonance. I know you're talking about the fact that it should be in context, but that it has a lot of the Irish music being appropriated by politics, and whether that's diminishing somewhat now.
Thank you. Well, I think that it's basically the same process actually that took place with the Scottish Gaelic culture during the Jacobite Wars, when Scots culture was essentially commodified, intent, and made fashionable by the establishment. And effectively, what was perceived as a cultural and ideological threat was tamed, domesticated, and essentially diluted, and later on included into the Victorian cultomaniac British imperial discourse. And I believe that to some extent, the reappropriation of rebel music into mainstream cultural continuity is maybe somewhat alike to this process, and some sort of a part of domesticating a rebel discourse and making it a part of the mainstream discourse. And of course, speaking of the communities that are in firm opposition to the mainstream discourse, of course, I did not actually ask my respondents if they see this as appropriation, but some of them mentioned words like sold out and something like that. So basically, obviously, they see it as some appropriation, but they seemed quite fatalistic about it. They reflect it as a fact, but they don't expect anything better from the mainstream media. And I believe that this is just the process of domesticating the discourse and making it a matter of heritage, a matter of history, but a matter of that history, not of continuing history.
Super, yeah, very good, thank you. Has anybody else got a question to ask for our speakers?
Yeah, I have a hand up, but I think there was somebody else before me, Fionnuala.
Okay, I can't.
I'm sorry, yeah, I wrote in a question into the chat box.
Okay.
So it should be there.
Off you go, yeah.
I can just read it if it's convenient. So I have a question for Ondřej and Jakub. So have you stumbled, for sure you stumbled, on news concerning events or processes happening in the capitalist West, which would be, on contrary, in Czechoslovakia, strongly overblown or exaggerated? And what came to my mind thinking about it was, because you speak about 1980s, the campaign regarding the threat of AIDS, which was quite visible, I believe, in the Czechoslovak media. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. Actually, it was visible in the Czechoslovak media, but I think the campaign was domestic. Yeah, so it was basically not so much projecting, let's say, AIDS to the West, but it was also an internal problem. But I would say there were other topics that were much more, we could say, exaggerated or overblown. Definitely, it would be the question of unemployment in the 1980s. Definitely, there would be, for example, the British walking struggles, maybe strikes in the coal industry, and so on and so forth. So definitely, they were pretty much informing them and putting them in a certain light, which was critical to the West, for sure. Thanks.
Super. There's somebody else, I can't see the hand, but who was it there that wanted to speak? Ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Katrina, is it? Okay, Katrina, yeah.
If I've seen the hands correctly, Fionnuala, I think Lorenza had her hand up before me. Lorenza Gianfrancesco.
Right, I can't seem to see
So I go up first and then I put my hand up.
That's great. Where's Lorenza?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I have, first of all, thank you to all speakers for their excellent papers. I can honestly say that I've learned a great deal from your talks. I have a very short question for Ondřej, Daniel. Ondřej, you, during the period Perestroika and Glasnost became part of the public discourse in the 80s, what was the contribution of the visual arts and the music scene in disseminating ideas, even within an underground artistic milieu? Because I have a very close friend from Prague who told me that it was the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, Hieronymus Bosch became an aspiring artist for many painters. And if we think about not only the style of the Hieronymus Bosch, but also the philosophy behind his paintings, I can think about the concept of chaos, but also transition.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lorenza, for this basically also answer and reply, because you said it all. And I think it's what I can underline is definitely when in the domestic discourse, we try to look at the transition starting from the 1989-1990, but definitely this kind of transition started much earlier. And we are trying to work on this, that there is a much, let's say, more subtle changes should be analyzed already since, let's say, the first third of the 1980s until probably the half of the 1990s. So it is this long period of changes. And yeah, in the visual arts and the music, it was the mostly creative, let's say, period, and the ambience was very vivid for these arts. So I can only underline that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your question, Lorenza. Katrina?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for a wonderful series of papers. I've two questions, if I may. One is for Ondřej, Daniel and Jakub Machek. And it's about whether you see parallels to what historians of the German Democratic Republic have explored for this period, the pre-Perestroika, pre-Glasnost decades, where the theory has been advanced that it's a so-called niche society at this time, that the difficulties of living under this highly surveillance regime force a kind of retreat into the domestic and private sphere. So that this is sort of disengagement from the public, and it's quite a contested theory, but there's a lot of work being done on, for example, the phenomenon of the summer house, the dacha, which many of the GDR citizens would have had, or naked bathing, or certain types of hobbies, and a sort of a domesticity that is a form of political non-engagement that itself is a subtle or implicit protest. So that would be my first question. And then a question to both of you and to Johana as well, which is about the post-imperial frame here, whether this comes into your into the materials you're looking at, that of course it's this situation of being in the nexus and the crossfire of expansionist ambitions, whether these be of Nazi Germany or coming under then the shadow of the Soviet empire, if we want to give it that word, and to what extent there's a post-imperial consciousness of having come out of the Habsburg Empire that also informs this framing of the media in this particular period of 20th century Czech and Czechoslovak history.
Okay, so who wants to go first? Do you want to start there?
Maybe I can start if Johana doesn't.
Yeah, sure, yep.
So yeah, it's definitely true also for the Czech or Czechoslovak society. Like as I told about the demand for a peaceful life, which is protected from all the dangers coming from the West, this is also valid for the peaceful life inside the family, inside the cottages, holiday cottages, inside their homes, which are protected from the dangers of the political life in the socialist society. Because after the 1968 invasion, there was some kind of the repression against the people who are involved in this liberal movement. So people rather stay at home, not involved in any kind of political issues, rather stay at home, not to talk too much loudly, and not to be involved in any political issues. So this is a kind of the domesticity and good life and material life, as it was mentioned in the last movie I was talking about. This was very important. So in that I skip it, but the hero of this generational movies, this is only one young hero who is not only rebelling, but who is thinking about the money, about the material life, who is not idealist, as is typical for another, like this generational gap movies. The young generation is idealist. In the 1970s, the official picture, of course, not the reality, but the official picture is these youngsters are not looking for anything like ideal. This is just looking for the materiality, for home, for good wages and good goods buying for this money. So this was this really domestic material life which was propagated.
Who wants to take it?
Yeah, if I can say a word about it. So we are talking about very different periods of time, of course. So there's a huge difference when it comes to some post-imperial prism, when it comes to post-1968 world, right? When the domesticity is the major topic and closing, actually, people are closing at their homes and just dealing with their stuff, because they can't do much else. But the period I am dealing with, that's the 20 years of first democratic Czechoslovak Republic, that's something that's a different topic, as basically, yes, so we got rid of this bounds to the Habsburg Empire and to German element, but Czechs and Slovaks as well, they don't want to stay closed inside. They want to be open to the world. They want to be part of the Western community. And that's all what actually I was also talking about, that we are waiting, we are expecting that we will be accepted by the West as equals, which of course doesn't happen. And then the huge trauma actually comes to the scene. And of course, then we could talk about how this was getting more problematic and more problematic, and then we are disappointed by the East as well, and it ends up in after 68 when people close in themselves. So that's just a quick analysis of how I would talk about the post-imperial, or if we can at all talk about post-imperial period for such a small country, actually in the middle of Europe, which will never be fully independent. I mean, in the imagination or in the understanding of the people, because we necessarily have to either be part of the West or the East, and it's kind of changing in the time all the time.
Okay. Did you want to say anything, Ondřej, on that?
I'm thinking about it, but it's not completely mature what I want to say. So I'm thinking maybe this kind of post-imperial, the experience with the imperial traditions, you can say, or different empires probably, is somehow, let's say, very much reflected in the present also, yeah, which we could say that since the 1990s, there was quite a lot of this narrative of catching up with the West, and the West was taken as a model with overall, it was basically with some exceptions, definitely of the far right and far left, the overall Czech, how to say, Czech collective consciousness, just to put it again in the words of the keynote, was let's say pro-West. Nevertheless, this changed a lot during the series of events, especially with after joining the European Union in 2004, economic crisis in 2008, and a series of crises since then. So I would say now there is again like this strong narrative that Johana spoke about, which is like the disappointment with the West. Yeah, is coming back to the game. So it's like repeating in the circles, and it's never-ending process. So this is only just to add it until the very contemporary period.
Thank you.
So this is all very, I'm sure we could talk for hours on this, but I know that you've got another session, Brenda. When's your next session starting?
The next session starts at 4. I mean, at 3. At 3.
At 3. So yes, so we're probably slightly over time. I want to thank all of our speakers, and I think what's wonderful is, you know, despite COVID, that it has really opened up internationalism and has allowed people access to academia and to these incredible insights that we ordinarily wouldn't have been. I was on a Shanghai call yesterday. I probably never get to go to Shanghai probably in the next, but it's great to be able to kind of go around the world to these conferences, and I've become a serial conference goer during COVID. So I'd like to thank everybody. Hopefully that you'll integrate some of the research. I'd be, from my own point of view, Mary, I'm really interested in that whole kind of cultural anthropology and republicanism. That's really interesting. And I love the idea of you know, Czechoslovakia, as you say, Brendan, soothing the soothing media is a really, I think if we come away with anything, that's a really interesting word, you know, soothing. And it kind of, it's sort of suitably nuanced for us not to have anything kind of negative around it. So thank you very much, everybody. You know, we look forward to the next sessions. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Finola.
Okay.